guide.
How are you?
You guys, how's it going?
Good.
You were meeting with Tony?
Yes, I saw Tony. We're using some data to show the importance between Mexico and the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. And it's an old data. We need to work on
Old data.
having new data.
It's always amazing to me how hard it is to do stuff that you would think would be readily available.
Exactly. How are you?
Good.
Have a seat. I'll introduce you all from here and invite you to come up. Unless you would like to speak right later,
Lights.
it's fine.
Whatever you think is best.
Yeah, it's easier to speak
Okay.
from up there,
Okay.
but it's fine. We'll be a few minutes.
It's going.
Let me see if I can.
Did you walk home yesterday?
No, I started walking that direction so I could catch a cab.
Ah, okay.
I took a cab home.
We walked
That'd have been a long walk.
Ah,
Where
okay.
were you staying?
Palomar.
Where's that? Oh no, that's like right. That's just outside of Georgetown.
Yeah, it's
That was
like,
like less than a 10-minute walk for you.
Yeah, well, yeah, more or less. Was okay. Nice walk.
But it was
actually.
yeah, no, the weather was okay.
Yeah.
So what are your plans for tonight?
I have dinner with one of an analyst that I have in the private sector. Now she's working at the World Bank. I want to know how she is. If I can take her back to Mexico. To
Oh,
work.
really?
She-
Like you stole Jose Luis back?
Yes, but she. No, we need Jose Luis in Mexico.
Yeah.
The other guy that we have. Ivan. Don't want to comment.
No, and it's great. I mean,
Susan, ¿qué tal? Hi, how are you? Es Fernando León, mi colega de Panamá.
you guys are very nice to meet you.
Hola, mucho gusto.
Gracias.
No, but having him there as sort of a link between Hacienda and the CMBV is probably really valuable for you guys.
No, it's very important. They changed the place.
Yeah, because it was a full house. You draw them in. You're a big draw.
How are you?
And that, much other stuff. So we're gonna start. We're gonna start with you.
When he's
Just confirm.
I think we'll get started here in about a minute. If people could make their way in, take your seats. We'll start shortly.
photos to go there.
Oh,
That's
really?
what he said.
We're gonna do it from the.
He said that. Unless you wanted to do it here.
Whatever he wants.
Whatever he wants. Sit, okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eric Olson, and I'm the Associate Director for the Latin American Program and a Special Advisor to the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. I want to welcome you all to our program this afternoon, Mexico and the United States, Combating Illicit Finance Together. I want to give a special welcome to our guests. Special guest today, Deputy Secretary Fernando Aportela from Mexico, and Assistant Secretary Danny Glazer. I'll introduce them in a little bit, a little more formally, but just wanted to welcome them first off. And also recognize a couple of special guests here this morning. Former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Tony Wayne, who is now here at the Wilson Center as a public policy scholar. We're glad to have you here, and he's definitely helped us prepare for this event as well. And also, of course, recognizing Duncan Wood, the director of the Mexico Institute, and my Mexico Institute colleagues. I'm sure there are other dignitaries here, but the light is so blinding, I'm not able to identify everybody. But we are delighted that you're here. We welcome the folks, the hundreds of million that are joining us online on the web stream. So thank you all very much. You know, it's widely known that the economic ties between the United States and Mexico are enormous and growing every day. My colleagues Duncan Wood and Chris Wilson have written about this extensively. U.S.-Mexico merchandise trade last year, 2015, was $531 billion, more than $1.5 billion a day. Over as many as 187 million people entered the United States legally from Mexico through legal ports of entry. Just a phenomenal exchange of humans, of merchandise, and of trafficking. And of course, electronic financial flows are in the tens of billions, and I don't even have a specific number, but undoubtedly it's an enormous amount. So given the enormous volume of financial, commercial, and human exchange between Mexico and the United States, each day, the task of ensuring the integrity of the financial systems in each country is enormous. What is clear in that, to me at least, is that neither Mexico nor the United States can or should tackle this challenge alone. The framework of shared responsibility and cooperation that is so important for fighting drug trafficking and human trafficking and illicit products is doubly necessary in efforts to combat illicit financial flows. So we are pleased today to welcome to the Wilson Center representatives from the government of Mexico and the United States to describe to us what they are doing together to confront this problem. It's a good news story in many ways. We'll start this afternoon with the presentation by Deputy Secretary Fernando Aportela from Mexico's Secretariat of Finance and Public Credit, often referred to as Hacienda in Mexico. Dr. Aportela was appointed to his current position on December 6, 2012. Prior to that, he was a managing partner at the investment bank Evercore Partners, and he has also served as General Director of Economic Research at the Bank of Mexico, as Area Director in Mexico's Economic Cabinet, and part of the Secretary of Finance and Public Credit's advisory team. He was also Undersecretary of Revenue for the government of the state of Veracruz. And we have a longer bio for him. I hope you took advantage of that when you came in. Next, we'll hear from Assistant Secretary for Secretary for Terrorist Financing at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, Mr. Daniel L. Glazer. Assistant Secretary Glazer was confirmed by the U.S. Senate in May 27, 2011, to serve in the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. As Assistant Secretary, he is responsible for helping to formulate and coordinate counter-terrorist financing and anti-money laundering policies and strategies for the department. He served previously as Treasury's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes from November 2004 to May 2011. We are delighted to have both of them here. We will hear their presentations. Then I'll ask them a couple questions, and time permitting, we'll also have questions for the audience. So I appreciate you coming. Secretary Portela, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I want to first thank the Wilson Center for hosting this event today. I want to thank Duncan. Thank you very much. I want to thank Eric for all the presentation. Say hello to Ambassador Wayne. Nice to see you again, Ambassador. I also want to thank Daniel Glazer, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, for having the idea of getting this event, which is very, very important for Mexico, and that we show the relationship that we are having and the coordination that we are having with the U.S. Treasury in Mexico. Eric mentioned how we are highly interconnected in our financial system and how we are highly also interconnected in our borders and our trade between Mexico and the U.S. Let me give you some numbers, some facts. In the financial sector, for example, more than 70% of the assets of the banking sector in Mexico are from U.S. banks. If you take into account full-owned U.S. banks, if you take into account investments, where there is some proportion of U.S. banks participation in the banks in Mexico, that number goes up to 1/3, more than 33%. Brokerage houses, the number is 12%. Insurance companies is more than 36%. So it is a very close ties in the financial sector that we have. It is also very true in the trade and borders. For example, this is a data that is not well known. Unfortunately, it's a little old, but in 2010, 6 million U.S. jobs were related to exports to Mexico. So we are directly connected to exports from the U.S. to Mexico. 1 million people cross every day in our border in a legal way, 300,000 cars, $1 million per minute of trade in our borders. So that's important. That is the relationship that we have. And of course, in this type of relationships, is even more important to fight illicit transactions and at the same time support integration to foster more integration in the financial and the community and services sector, and also to promote, for example, financial inclusion. So we have to deal with this trade-off in terms of what we are doing to tackle financial crimes and allowing at the same time a more robust good progress in the integration of our economies along the way. So when President Peña came to the administration in at the end of 2012, we came and see our friends at the Treasury, and we were very fortunate to find Danny there, and we start working to have a joint agenda in order to foster this development. And we work on, I will say, on 4 main aspects. One is public policy, second, regulatory framework, third, supervisory activities, and then the operations and how we were going to operate everything. And let me go over each one of them. In public policy, I think we all agree on the main goal, which is fighting financial crimes. But how do we do that, and how do we achieve that, and how do we get to know what should be our priorities is a more difficult way, is a more difficult task. So what we decided to have is to have bilateral groups. And we implemented those bilateral groups between public officials in both sides, so in both countries, and the private sector, and also groups which are, for example, just private sector banks. So, for example, we have what is called the bilateral public-private group, which have the supervisory authorities, the Treasury, la Secretaría de Hacienda, and for example, we have BBVA, Banamex, Santander, Banco Azteca, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Citi, and Bank of America participating in that group. And there is a private banks group from US and Mexican banks, which is the Zócalo group, which is also working. And what is important from those groups is that it helps us to understand our concerns, to share information, and to have common goals. And from that, we get a lot of insights in what should be the agenda that we needed to have. And this is, for example, these groups are are still working. They have an important agenda. So that helps us, for example, to frame the type of regulation that we wanted to have. And let me now talk about regulation. The first thing is that we have in Mexico a regulation that is compliant with FATF. Actually, we got removed from the enhanced follow-up process of FATF in March 2014. We have, Mexico has a law that was enacted in 2012 for MLA and CFT issues. According to this law, all financial entities have to comply with anti-money laundering and counter financing terrorism regulation. We also, in that law, designated non-financial businesses and professions that have to comply with the MLA and CFT regulation. which are, for example, real estate, car sales, jewelry, notary public. So we have that, but we did more than that. For example, in December 2014, we amended the MLA SFT regulation to allow to create, and this is very important, a mechanism to share information of Mexican banks with foreign banks. And that was important because that allows to help in reducing the problems that we have with corresponding banking. We allow the U.S. Banks to have more knowledge of Mexican clients. So they can do, and they have informed decisions of what to do with these clients, and to proceed or not to proceed with the relationship with the client in Mexico. That's something that was important. Also, in 2014, after the financial reform that we did in January of that year, we allow, for example, that the Financial Intelligence Unit of Mexico, the UIF, or the UIF, can have a list for designated individuals and companies of concern for terrorism and terrorist financing. And we include in that list also individuals and companies for money laundering, which is a very important aspect of what we are trying to fight. It is now 2 years that we have the list. We have more than 1,500 individuals and companies in the list. What is important is that we do not only have persons and companies coming from the list of the UN or the OFAC. We have, for example, 500 persons and companies included in the list that come from own analysis of the UIF, the Mexican Financial Intelligence Unit. And the implication of the list is basically that any bank that has a client or will have a client that is on the list has to stop immediately any transaction with that person of company. So overall, what I'll say is that we have a good regulation that it complies with FATF, that in this process, for example, the information sharing is something that came out from the bilateral groups, that we needed to have that, and we apply that, and we work that together with the Treasury. And just one final point about regulation is that there is an independent U.S. firm that make an evaluation of the Mexican regulation, and it found that in terms of the depth and the detail, the breadth and the detail of our regulation, it is in similar terms of the one of the U.S. Let me now move to supervision. In supervision, we are moving to a framework which is called a risk-based approach. And in that case, our National Banking and Securities Commission, the CNBV in Mexico, is working fully to transition to an RBA approach, to a risk-based approach. And in a risk-based approach, basically the supervisor has to prioritize and enhance supervision on on-site visits. It has to assess the measures that the institutions are taking to mitigate risks. It has to apply also sanctions that are at the same time proportionate and dissuasive. So we are working into that framework, and now the CNBV is doing this comprehensive review of risk profiles of sectors and institutions. It's collaborated very closely with the UIF, with our Financial Intelligence Unit, but also with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, with FinCEN. We are reviewing all of our internal procedures. And one thing that is very important, we are reviewing of our guidance to banks in order to use the regulation and to apply the regulation. One thing that is very important in all this process is that financial institutions are not scared of the regulator. And for that, they have to have, at the end of the day, it's also our responsibility to provide guidance of what we expect from them in all the processes that we are applying. So that's something that we are working on, and we are truly convinced that that is the way to go, and we are moving ahead of that. In operations, and that is the final main aspect that we have been working on in the agenda with the U.S. Treasury and all the regulatory institutions here in the U.S. For example, we have had very clear successes there. The UIF and FinCEN have worked together in a very in a very good way. I think that we have gained an important level of trust from the U.S. institutions, and we continue to work that. So now we do joint MLA investigations. And we have seen with these joint investigations, we have had successes. And some of them have already produced the disarticulation of money laundering organizations and the prosecution of some of the responsible parties. And we have even been recognized for that. We won the Egmont Group for Financial Intelligence Units. We won the Best Egmont Case Award, BECA, for money laundering, together, the UIF and FinCEN, in 2014. Another thing that we are doing together, for example, we are sharing information in our customs. So we got the declaration of people entering or leaving Mexico in the cash or the monetary instruments that they have, and the U.S. Customs also got it. And we share that information, so we check the consistency, and we are using that information to find some interesting cases. So this is a work in progress, and I'm taking a little more than the time allows. But let me just say that in this specific issue, which is a very important one, which is fighting financial crimes, we are in a true partnership with the U.S., working together with this common agenda of fighting financial crimes. And at the same time, we are working also to have our financial system highly integrated to produce all these positive aspects of having financial inclusion and having more development and more depth in our financial system. So with that, thank you for your time, and thanks again to the Wilson Center for the invitation.
Thank you. Assistant Secretary Glazer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting this event and for inviting Fernando and I here, and to Secretary Portela. Thank you so much for coming up to Washington for this, what I think is a very important event. And thank you really for all of the collaboration and for your friendship. It's been very important to me, both professionally and personally, and I extend that to Fernando's team who's here, Jose Luis Stein from the CNBV and Narciso Campos from Hacienda. We could not ask for a more collaborative, closer, and a better group of colleagues than we have with your team here, and all the people back home in Mexico City. Please thank them for me. I also just it's been done already, but I want to recognize Tony Wayne. Tony, former ambassador to Mexico, could just as easily be up here with us, and probably should be up here with us. That we were. Fernando was very nice to say that he thought it was lucky that I happened to be at Treasury at the time that this issue became more prominent. But we were all very lucky that Tony was happened to be the ambassador in Mexico when this issue became more prominent. Tony and I go way back, and Tony was the assistant secretary in the Economic Bureau right after 9/11, when 9/11 occurred, and in the days after, and he was one of the leading U.S. government officials that was orchestrating our financial response to 9/11. I was just a young punk, just happy to be in the room at the time when Assistant Secretary Wayne was leading the efforts. Now, a lot has changed. Now I'm just an older punk, happy to be in the room at the time. But we were really lucky, and a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about, Tony took a big hand in shaping, and I'm going to point some of those out when I get to them. But to jump right into it, and I'll just so Eric and Fernando and I had a phone call a few days ago where we were preparing, just coordinating for this event, and Fernando sort of ran through the things that he was planning on talking about, and I ran through the things that I was planning on. It was the exact same things. We basically had the exact same speech. So Fernando and I got into a little argument as to who was going to go first and who was going to go second, because whoever went first actually had to do the whole thing, and whoever went second was just going to be able to sort of tie up the loose ends. So I prevailed in that, and Fernando had to give the whole thing. And I'm not gonna repeat everything Fernando says, because I thought he did a nice job of running through a lot of the important initiatives that we are working together with the Mexican government on. But I would like to put it in, sort of speak about it from a U.S. perspective and put it in our own context, which is not going to be really that different, but I think it's important to articulate it. Because as Fernando said, it's important for people to understand that the United States and Mexico really are working in partnership on issues of mutual concern, and certainly right at the top of that list is protecting our integrated financial system from abuse by a number of by money launderers, by organized criminals, by drug trafficking organizations. And this is an issue that we've both identified as a priority, and as a result, it's an issue we've both cooperated on, and I think very effectively. And I think that we have some pretty decent results to show for it. I think it's important, and I want to state this for two reasons. It's important for two reasons. The obvious and most important reason why it's important is to actually undermine the financial networks of drug trafficking organizations, to make it costlier, riskier, less efficient for them to move their money, to interrupt their operations, to make it less profitable for them, to prevent them from expanding their influence through the financial system, corrupting institutions, corrupting governments. This is at the end of the day why we do it. And that is, of course, going to always be our number one priority and the reason why we're frankly in this business to begin with. There's a second important reason why we're working on it, though, and that is safeguarding the integrity of our financial system. Because I think it's important for people to understand, for the financial community to understand, for citizens to understand that we are doing everything we can to keep the banking system clean, to keep the financial system free from illicit penetration. And we're always going to be aspiring to that, but it's because in the long run, even putting aside the impact it has on drug trafficking organizations, in the long run, and I think, and I'll get to this, you'll be able to see it even in this presentation, but in the long run, that work is going to make our financial system stronger. It is going to make our financial systems more integrated. It is going to enhance the ties and connectivity between the U.S. and Mexican financial system, which is important in its own right, to support a lot of the important economic cooperation and collaboration that and integration that Fernando was talking about. So again, I think we need to keep that in mind, that we're doing it primarily at the end of the day, we're doing this to get at the drug trafficking organizations, but it also, I think, in the long run, has the impact of actually bringing our financial systems together in a stronger, more integrated fashion. So, how do we approach this? We approach it, at least the way you could divide it up in any number of categories, but I think about it in two ways: operational cooperation and then systemic cooperation. The operational cooperation is obviously harder to talk about. I see Mary Beth Gunstras here from the Department of Justice, Asset Forfeiture and Money Laundering section. They obviously have a tremendous amount of work that they're doing with the Mexican government and with Mexico and with Mexican law enforcement to actually, conduct real, important criminal investigations. But we also play a role in that at the Treasury Department. We engage in very, very active information and intelligence sharing with the Mexicans. We have a very, very active collaboration, as Fernando said, between our financial intelligence units, the WEAF in Mexico and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, here in the United States. And even just at the embassy, there is a Treasury attaché at the embassy in Mexico. There's a FinCEN attaché. There's an OFAC attaché. There's a attaché from the Criminal Investigative Division of the IRS. I was actually sitting here thinking, is there another embassy in the world that we have that kind of Treasury representation at? And I don't quote me on this. I don't think there is. I'm almost positive there's not. I'd have to go back and check, but I'm pretty sure there's not. And I think what that really underscores is how important this is to us. That we're working with them from a financial intelligence unit to financial intelligence unit channel. We also have our sanctions office present there on the ground, full time, sharing information, engage in joint targeting with the Mexican authorities to identify the individuals and entities within Mexico that we can be taking action on in terms of sanctions and excluding from the financial system, and then working with the Mexican government to make sure that those individuals are also excluded from the Mexican financial system. And that's something that there's very, very active cooperation on, and I think is important. The Treasury attaché there covers the full range of issues between Mexico, a lot of these operational stuff, but importantly, a lot of the systemic stuff that I'm going to get to later on. And obviously, the criminal investigators from the IRS are supporting a lot of the important work that DOJ is up to with the Mexicans. So that's the operational cooperation that's going on. What I think is really, though, interesting is the systemic cooperation. You know, the Treasury Department, and I'm basically in charge of the National Security Policy Office at the Treasury Department, and we talk a lot about protecting the U.S. financial system from abuse from a variety of sources. But there's nothing more important in that regard than protecting it from abuse by drug trafficking organizations, because we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that is running its proceeds through the U.S. financial system, through the Mexican financial system. This is something that we need to be looking at, not just from a ground-up law enforcement perspective, which we need to be doing and are doing, but also from a systemic perspective. What is it? What are the weaknesses in our financial system that lend itself to abuse, and how do we close this? How do I identify them and close them? And as I said, as we do that, we create more confidence in the financial system, and we enhance the credibility of the financial system and the interconnectivity of the financial system. So we've instituted a number of initiatives that put us in a position to do this jointly with our Mexican colleagues. The first one, and this one is attributable to Tony, and that's the strategic dialogue on illicit finance that's run out of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. And that is an opportunity to bring all the various components of the U.S. government that are represented at the embassy, which is like every component of the United States government, I can assure you, and then all the various components of the Mexican government coming and sitting down together and doing precisely this, trying to identify trends that one side or the other is seeing, trying to identify places where we think the other guy is maybe not doing as well as he could be, and saying, here's what we think you all should be doing, and I promise you that happens in both directions. Talking about different authorities that we have that we could put at each other's disposal, and really trying to, make sure that the Mexican government as a whole and the United States government as a whole is working together seamlessly on the issue of illicit finance. And I come down from time to time, and I'll co-chair that group with one of my counterparts who's not here, Alberto Bazbaz, but I should give him a shout out too, because he's really, really important in all of this. He's the director of the WEAF in Mexico, and also really very much part of the team. And so Alberto and I will sometimes chair these meetings of the strategic dialogue on illicit finance, and try to lend our little extra push to it. And so that's a strategic dialogue on illicit finance. The second thing, and what I think is even a little bit more exciting, is, Fernando mentioned this, but I want to really, really foot stomp it, the public-private dialogue that we have between the United States and Mexico. This is a group that it comprises the United States government, the Mexican government, United States financial institutions, like the big dollar-clearing U.S. financial institutions, and Mexican financial institutions. It was initially established for the reason that, in our view, the private sector was going to have experience and insight into what's really happening on the ground in terms of illicit finance that we might not have in the government, and we wanted a forum that enabled us to glean that information, work with the private sector, feed information back to the private sector to enhance our efforts against illicit finance. And I think it actually has served that purpose. I think everybody involved with it would say it served that purpose. But something actually really interesting happened along the way, and that was, I can't believe I'm proactively raising this issue in a speech. The issue of de-risking a few years ago reared its ugly head, and there became concern that there was pressure on correspondent relationships between U.S. banks and Mexican banks, and Fernando talked about this. And this is something that we clearly was an issue of concern in both Washington and in Mexico City, because of just how important this financial connectivity is, and we wanted to make sure that we were doing everything that we could to make sure that financial connectivity persisted. understanding that the United States can't tell U.S. banks who to do business with, Mexican government can't tell Mexican banks who to do business with. But what we could do is create a dialogue, create an environment which lended itself to information sharing, which lended itself to communication, which lended itself to common purpose and working to ensure that these relationships remain strong. And the public-private partnership already existed, and this was an issue that was sort of dropped into it and became, for a couple of years, the primary issue. I mean, in some respects, the only issue that the public-private partnership was working on, but it succeeded phenomenally. One of the, for example, and Fernando made reference to this, one of the real problems that was identified was that there was a provision in Mexican law that made it difficult for Mexican financial institutions to share certain information that the U.S. financial institutions were looking for. And everybody identified that as something that was really working against this, making sure that these correspondent relationships remain strong. So the Mexicans were able to take that back, and they addressed that issue legally. Then we came back to the group with that. We worked together on forms, like really, really glamorous issues like working on forms. But we got the forms right, and the forms are now being used by the banks to share this information. And it's really, I think, sort of stabilized what people who had previously been worried was a situation that might be going in the wrong direction. And I know, and I could tell you, this was an issue that received personal attention both from Minister Vidagraj and from Secretary Liu. And I know that when Secretary Liu speaks about the issue of de-risking, he always points back to the cooperation that we have with Mexico as a model that we can and in fact are trying to replicate in other parts of the world. And so this is what I was talking about before, that in trying to tackle some of these illicit finance issues, not only, and that information sharing between U.S. and Mexican banks, by the way, is important first and foremost because it actually allows us to be more effective in our anti-money laundering enforcement. And again, that's what this always comes back to, and you have to remind yourself that's what it always comes back to, allowing us to be more effective in enforcing money laundering laws against the range of bad guys, but in this case especially the drug trafficking organizations. And that was a big step forward in that effort. But what it also did was strengthen the connectivity, it strengthened the communication, it strengthened the relationships between U.S. financial institutions and Mexican financial institutions, which is important in its own right. There's a lot of other things that we work very closely with our Mexican counterparts on. A few years ago, the Mexican government imposed restrictions on the use of cash dollars within the Mexican economy. This is something that obviously is a big important issue for Mexico, but it's also an important issue for the United States. After all, we're talking about U.S. cash dollars. So it's something that we really coordinate on very closely. And there's been any number of times where I've traveled down to Mexico, or Fernando's traveled up here to Washington to really talk about that issue and make sure that we're always on the same page. And even quite recently, there was a joint Mexican-U.S. team. Narciso led it for the Mexican side. That went down to San Diego and to Tijuana to talk to institutions on both sides of the border to understand what the impact of these regulations are and to understand how that's playing out, and again to feed information back to us and back to the Mexicans on how we could be doing better and how we could be more effective and how we could have a negative impact on the drug trafficking organizations without causing too much of a burden on our financial institutions, which are providing important services to Mexicans and Americans. So that's just another example of what's been a really important collaborative relationship. Again, I want to thank Fernando and his team for being such good colleagues, and I want to thank everybody for coming and hearing us out, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Our guests need to leave here around 2 o'clock, so I'm going to just throw out one question. I don't know if Ambassador Wayne or Duncan have a question, and we'll take a few from the audience as well, but we'll try to keep them pretty short. You both alluded to it a little bit, but I wondered if you would talk a little more about the real dynamic way in which money laundering happens. And in particular, it seems like, governments always have this struggle. We have to pass laws and new regulations and create new institutions and frameworks. And clearly a lot has been done. I don't mean to minimize that. But I also wonder about how we kind of anticipate the problems coming forward. The criminals are pretty clever when it gets right down to it, and we're rules-based and they're not. And so what is the component of this architecture that you've established, very, very important, that allows you to kind of look forward, anticipate trends? I think Assistant Secretary referred to one point trends, looking at trends. I think that's really important. Could you say a bit more on both sides of how you do that, anticipating problems going forward?
Well, sure. Look, there's always going to be a whack-a-mole component to this. There's always going to be trying to identify exactly what's going on and then going after the perpetrators. And as you said, they're very creative and innovative, and certainly it's a dynamic, right? It's a dynamic playing field. So any action we take is going to have a reaction, and we have to understand that. And we have to work very closely with our intelligence community and our law enforcement community to understand precisely what's going on. That said, there's also a systemic aspect to it, an understanding that while we know we're never going to, eliminate money laundering, we're not going to eliminate crime. I mean, that's a nice goal to have, but that's a long-term goal. What we can do, and this is the phrase that I always use, is make our system a hostile environment for that activity to occur, to make it, again, to use a phrase I use a lot, costlier, riskier, less efficient to move money, and to make organizations, to make this be a vulnerability to organizations rather than a strong point for organizations. And that's what's important on the systemic side. It's why, frankly, to give us us a little plug, last week we announced, including the President of the United States, announced important reforms to our customer due diligence regulations here in the United States. And why we sent up to Congress a very important beneficial ownership legislation that will allow us to do better at identifying the beneficial owners of companies. This is important, and it will provide important information to law enforcement. It's why we do engage in such vibrant trend analysis and information exchange between the two countries and within the governments of the countries, and why we did do trips like the trip to Tijuana and San Diego, the Narciso and others were on, because we do understand that when you look at the Mexican dollar restrictions, I don't want to talk too much about it because that's something that Fernando should be talking about, but when you put something like that into effect, that it's going to create a reaction, and it's going to change the way money flows, and it's going to change the way the drug trafficking organizations move their money, and it's going to lead to, for example, cash smuggling, more cash smuggling than you saw before, and actually in some interesting directions that you might not expect. And so we need to be aware of that, and then we need to adapt both the rules and the system to account for it. And that's one of the things that we do within the CITIF, the Strategic Dialogue on Illicit Finance. That's one of the precise things that we do. And at the same time, target your operational activities, again, to go after the money launderers where they are. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I think about it.
I'll say that the information sharing is very important, and to have another thing that we are working and that we have solved some issues. When he says about Danny says about the forms, is actually they are very important, because that is what allows actually to use the information to do analysis and to also to do big data analysis in all the trends that we see. In the Mexican case, it's a little easier to change some of the stuff in the regulation, because some of them you don't need to go to Congress. You just have to adapt our internal regulation, and that's something that allows having a better framework, which is what we did in the financial reform in 2014, allows to do more stuff. And for example, this issue about knowing who is the owner of the transaction, the beneficial owner. In 2014, we amend the regulation, so including trusts. You have to know the beneficial owner. You have to know you have to have, for the financial institutions, you have to have the KYC for trust, which was an important part. In the case of cash restrictions that we had, what we did was something that actually to have more information and say, we want to distinguish between licit business and illicit business. So what we ask for banks is that if they wanted to receive more cash in their banks, U.S. dollar cash, they have to ask for something for some requirements for the companies or the companies that are actually asking for that. It has to be a company that has to be in place for at least 3 years. You have to know the tax returns. You have to know the financial statement. You have to know the owners of the companies, and the companies have to prove that they receive cash in the legal way and for what reasons. So once you have that, then you don't have a limit in how much money you can receive. So that's important, because at the end of the day, as Danny said, we are making more hostile the environment for illicit, but at the same time we are trying to have licit transactions coming through the financial market and because we have more information at the end of the day. And that is something, having more information and having a better use of the information give us more insights in how we have to respond and how we can anticipate to these type of crimes.
Great. I don't know, Duncan, did you have a question? Would you? Yeah.
Thank you. It follows on directly from that. I'm interested in how you measure success, because the operational issues are one thing, systemic issues are another thing. It's almost as though if there isn't a problem, you've been successful. But how do we know that you were the ones who were responsible for there being no problem? So what metrics do you use? Subsecretario, you mentioned a couple of examples where you've been given prizes for collaboration, for investigations, etc. It would be really helpful to have more information about where you succeed in operations, so that we can tell the positive story. Because the institutional collaboration that you've mentioned is fantastic, but it's almost as if you're truly successful, we actually won't hear anything about it.
So have you heard anything about it? Look, I think you put your finger on a really important issue, and it's one that we think about all the time, and I'm not sure that we have a lot of great answers yet. How do you measure success in this area, whether you're talking about money laundering or terrorist financing, for that matter? I mean, it's a question I get asked all the time. It is by definition, right, a covert, a covert activity. So. We don't have a baseline number that we could say there was this much money laundering that happened in year one, and it's X plus Y in year two, or X minus Y in year two, and so we could say we've been successful or unsuccessful. We can't do that. So you're forced to go to secondary. You're forced to go to secondary measures, and you look at seizures and forfeitures. You look at but even with that lends itself to its own questions. If you get a huge forfeiture, is that is that because they're moving more money than ever, or is it because you're getting better at catching it? So it's a really, really difficult problem for us, and we try to put as much put as much information out as possible, so that people could make their own decisions and do their own analysis, even as we try to do to ours. There's an organization, for those of you who are not familiar with it, called the Financial Action Task Force, which is the premier anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing standard-setting body. This is something that FATF has really taken up in a very serious way recently, and it's a pretty courageous step for FATF to take, because nobody's really cracked this problem. But FATF is focused as they've never been before on the question of effectiveness, because what you're talking about really comes down to everybody spending a lot of time and effort in the public sector and in the private sector on putting systems in place to prevent illicit finance. How effective are those systems that are being put in place? And it's something that FATF is focused quite diligently on right now, and it'll be really interesting to see the types of things they come up with.
Well, another part of probably which I will call a success, and it's an ongoing work also, is one of the unintended consequences of all this fighting of financial crimes, which was de-risking and corresponding banking. And Danny mentioned that in his comments. Is at the beginning of this administration, it was really a very important problem in terms of closing accounts from U.S. banks to Mexican banks, and then the reflection of that was a closing of accounts from Mexican banks to other type of financial intermediaries, and that that was creating a very important problem for these non-bank institutions, and also for financial inclusion, because sometimes low-income individuals are the ones who depend on those type of institutions to do their financial activities. So that was that's something that we together with the U.S. Treasury and together with the private sector work a lot on having this information sharing mechanism, on trying to have some guidance on how are we doing that. We are not yet out of the woods, but at least the problem has not been getting bigger over time. So now we have some. I will say that is also a success on the positive side.
Good. All right, we have time for a couple questions here, there. I can't see in the back very well, so Andrea or Victoria, if you see somebody in the back, please call on them. Wait for the microphone because folks on online need to be able to hear. So why don't we go here? And then right here. I'll come to you next, sir.
Hi, I'm Ariel Rosen. I'm with Southern Pulse. I just had a question for you guys specifically regarding local government officials engaging in illicit finance. So I know you touched upon drug cartels and different people engaging in money laundering, and I was wondering what your current agenda is to specifically target public officials engaging in money laundering that could even affect the United States, involving U.S. banks, etc. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Right here?
I'm Rafael Bernal with The Hill. I'll give you a quick one since time is an issue. Is it legally viable to use the financial rules in the Patriot Act to restrict remittances? Because somebody suggested doing that.
Right. Was there a question in the back rows or the back?
Microphone.
Back. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I'm from the Council on Administrative Affairs. I wanted maybe to go on a little bit on the debate, or like the point you made on further identifying trends and tackling crimes related to drug trafficking. How does your collaboration articulate with the drug policy side, especially in the frame of an intense debate and a change in the drug policy, change in the paradigm of the drug policy side? Thank you.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that question?
I'm
I don't
not sure
think
I
heard
understood
it.
exactly. So
Sorry,
say one more time.
How do your work articulate, how do you collaborate with the side of the drug policy implementation?
Okay.
Because in the US and in Mexico, drug policies are changing, so it will have an impact on drug flows. And how do you work according to that?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.
Me
Danny, you wanna
first?
start?
Okay, so with respect to the question on corruption, corruption's an important issue. I think today there's a big global corruption conference that the UK is hosting, that Secretary Kerry is participating in. So corruption is an issue that I am sure, I don't want to speak for Fernando, but both our governments take quite seriously and understand how important fighting corruption is. As I said, the systemic safeguards that we put into effect for anti-money laundering, again, I was talking about them in the context of drug trafficking, but it's certainly not just with regard to the drug trafficking organizations. A transparent financial system is important across the board for preventing financial crime. One thing I'll highlight, for example, is the geographic targeting order that FinCEN recently issued with respect to Manhattan and Miami to look at real estate purchases, the use of cash in real estate purchases. That type of activity goes directly to concerns about corruption, where the sources are for individuals who are purchasing some of these high-value properties, and that goes directly to the question of corruption. And it's an issue that we are cooperating with the Mexican government on in terms of information exchange as well. Again, I certainly am the wrong person, and it wouldn't be appropriate in any case for me to get into discussions on actual law enforcement investigations that are going on. But I could tell you certainly from the perspective of the systemic efforts against money laundering, corruption is very much front and center in our minds, and the types of things that we're concerned about and the types of things that we want to exclude from the financial system. As far as questions go, so I certainly don't want to get into any discussions about proposals by any that come out of the presidential campaign. I will say that, and I haven't analyzed the legality of any proposal that's come out of any of the campaigns. With respect to our view of the Bank Secrecy Act, we of course are very serious about implementation of the Bank Secrecy Act and all our anti-money laundering laws in a way that targets criminal activity, and again in a way that strengthens the integration of the financial systems between the United States and Mexico. With respect to the question of coordination with policy, yes, I mean, the office of the ONDCP is the office within the United States government that coordinates U.S. Policy with respect to drugs, and they're very much a part of all our conversations.
Good. Would you like to add anything?
Well, about corruption, this is something that it is a work that has taken the whole administration, and it's something that we are really working on. And we have passed some legislation, and it's I'll say it's of the utmost importance for our administration. Of course, every information that we have, any bad or suspicious activity, it's something that we report, and it's something that is used at the end of the day. In the case of the remittances, what I will say is that what will happen at the end of the day is, if you get to achieve something like that, some of the flows will not go to our regulated channels, and that is not good for many reasons. First, it has a problem with it tends to be low-income individuals, the people that send those type of flows, so it will be more expensive and more insecure for them to send those flows through less regulated channels. And second, we will get less information at the end of the day. And getting less information precisely is what creates challenges to all the things that we are doing together in this joint effort. And about policy, I think that what we are looking into, or what we are talking here, is much bigger and issues in terms of the quantities and the dimensions and the negative effects that these the type of financial crimes that we are fighting. So the agenda that we are following precisely tackles into that, into have a more comprehensive, a more complete, and more secure financial system for these big financial crimes that we are seeing.
Okay. If people will be very brief, I'll take two more questions. Okay, there's one right here. Did I miss anybody in the back?
You ready?
All right. Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, I just have a question. Danny, you mentioned that the administration is passing, or should say, attempting to pass new initiatives, which I would think are very good. But the big question is, the administration has taken 3 years since the 39th 8th summit was held to do this. And even if this is a good idea, do you think I think it would be probably surprising that this Congress enacted proposed legislation, since prior legislation introduced on at least 3 occasions never gained any momentum, even though the proponents were mainly responding to the 2003 FATF standards?
So just to be clear, the administration announced a number of initiatives last week. One of the most important ones being new customer due diligence regulations requiring financial institutions to identify the beneficial owner of corporations. That's an on the books regulation now. That's not anything that we need congressional action for. So that's an affirmative step that the administration took. There's a phase-in period for it, obviously, but that's an on the books regulation. What we do need congressional action for is the legislation requiring the disclosure of beneficial ownership at the time of incorporation. As you point out, this has been an issue that has been identified for a long time, including by the administration in President Obama's 2011 transnational organized crime strategy. It was identified as something that we needed to work on, and as you've pointed out, there's been a number of proposals in Capitol Hill to address the issue. We have the administration now has a proposal, and I think it is important for Congress to act. But there's at the end of the day, we need Congress to act. I will say I do think that both of those improvements in our anti-money laundering regime need to be understood in the context of what I regard as the strongest anti-money laundering regime in the world. We have thousands of anti-money laundering prosecutions a year. We have billions of dollars in fines on financial institutions for not following anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing rules. We have, I don't want to put a number on it, at least millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars in forfeitures per year. There is no government in the world that takes the fight against money laundering more seriously than the United States. And while we recognize that we have deficiencies that have been pointed out to us by FATF, which we ourselves have acknowledged, I don't think it's fair to take those deficiencies, take from those deficiencies the implication that this is not something that the Treasury Department, that the Justice Department, that our law enforcement agencies, that our regulators aren't all working as hard as they can on, because they are.
Great. Maybe I can ask one last question of the Secretary. I mean, I guess, there's a lot of good news here. There's a lot of laws, working groups, cooperation, but an important aspect of this has got to be enforcement and accountability at the end, prosecutions of people who violate the law. And so I'm just wondering, I realize you're not the Procuraduría, you're Hacienda, but I just, there must be some degree of cooperation and collaboration. Can you tell us, a little bit about progress in that regard as well?
We work close together with them, and for example, some of these, the case that I mentioned that we got this recognition, this award, this joint case, there are people now that is in prison for that.
Okay.
So we have results. Obviously, we should. We always like to have more, and sometimes it's a little difficult, but we have some progress, and we are working together with the PGR, and we have close collaboration with them. And some of these persons are already in jail. So.
And Hacienda has a WIF, as you said, Unidad de
We have a WIF.
Financial Intelligence, but Procuraduría, the justice system, has their own sort of FinCEN counterpart.
They have some intelligence unit there, but we are the ones that provide the data and the cases.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our guests today for their willingness. I want to thank my friends and colleagues from the Mexico Institute. There's a late announcement here. Okay. All right. Thank you all, Victoria and Angela and Andrea, for your help, and the AV team as well. Thank you very much for being part of us.
No, thank you.
you very
Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a lot of food downstairs, so if you're still hungry or you got hungrier during the session, please join us downstairs on the 5th floor. Sorry.
Good, I thought so. What do you think? Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thanks.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Eric.
Encantado.